in former President Donald Trump's criminal hush money trial. After jury selection wrapped up on Friday, the 12-person jury is made up of 7 men and 5 women, along with 6 alternates. Later this morning, both the prosecution and the defense are expected to lay out their cases during opening statements. According to the New York Times, the prosecution plans to frame Trump's actions of payments to keep adult film actress Stormy Daniels quiet about an alleged affair as election interference. The defense, meanwhile, will seize on 3 apparent weak points: witness credibility, the president's culpability, and the case's legal complexity. One of the potential first witnesses expected to testify is David Pecker, the former CEO of American Media Incorporated, who bought and buried damaging stories about Trump. It's called Catch and Kill. He is alleged to have worked with Trump and his former attorney, Michael Cohen, to bury the Stormy Daniel story. Other witnesses expected to testify include Michael Cohen, Stormy Daniels, former Trump aide Hope Hicks, and former Playboy model Karen McDougall, who also alleged a sexual relationship with Trump. And as former President Trump left court on Friday, he continued to insist that he plans to testify in his own defense. Joining us now, former litigator and MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin, and also MSNBC legal analyst Danny Saalo. Sorry about that. We thought we were going to hear Trump, but obviously we've heard what we had to say 1,000 times. So, Lisa, what do we expect today? We know that one of the first witnesses is David Pecker, but do you expect that opening statements get finished today? Or just technically, what are we looking for in terms of getting accomplished today in court?
Mika, a lot of the judicial housekeeping that you would expect to be taken care of before the trial really starts has all been brushed off Judge Merchan's plate. He's decided all of the pretrial motions. We have a jury, as you noted, that's been sat. So I expect that very soon after 9:30 this morning, we will get to opening statements. And while neither of the parties has outlined exactly how long they will take, as Danny knows better than anyone, an opening statement is your opportunity to preview your case for the jury. And while you want to do that in a way that gives them an overview, you also don't want to exhaust them. I expect that neither side will take more than roughly 60 to 70 minutes. And that means that we will have time to get to the first witness, who, as you noted, is expected to be former chairman of American Media and the National Enquirer, David Pecker.
Lisa, where are we on jurors these days? Because 2 had to leave, and there were only 6 spares to begin with. So does that mean we're down to 4 potential spares? Or
no,
there's still, how many do we have left? And are they sequestered? Can you just talk a little bit about how they are being managed, so to speak, during this process as all this intense scrutiny and there's so much press surrounding it?
Right. So the 2 jurors that we lost were replaced that same day, leading to a total of 12 jurors who have been seated. In addition to that, we do have 6 alternates. The jurors, however, are not sequestered, Elise. There have been accommodations made to ensure their anonymity. However, we don't know, for example, what provisions are being taken to get them to the courthouse for their departure from the courthouse, what the lunch provisions are. In federal court, in the E. Jean Carroll trials, both of those juries were not only anonymous, but steps were taken to ensure that, for example, they didn't come directly from their home to the courthouse. They met the U.S. Marshals at an off-site location and then were brought to the courthouse underground so that nobody would see their comings and goings. I'm hopeful that Judge Merchan is able to make some similar provisions for the jurors in this case so that they can remain protected throughout the duration of the trial.
So here's the thing. I think juror attrition could be a real problem in this case. I mean, just do the math. Last week, we lost 2 jurors before the trial even began. When you think about it, you do lose jurors during a trial. I've lost them. They fell asleep. They don't follow the judge's orders. But you don't normally lose a juror after the moment they're selected and between that and the time that the trial actually begins, because ordinarily, nothing happens during that time. But in this case, you have an example where a juror goes home, they start really thinking about their duty and what this is going to entail, and they come back and say, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore. By the way, that's also something that happens from time to time. I've had it in organized crime cases. You have jurors who come up to the judge and say, I'll do anything, please. I do not want to be on this jury. I'm afraid. That's not obviously the same situation here, but you do have jurors who are going to have second thoughts. And the question becomes, will 6 alternates be enough to cover this trial? I hope so. But if what we've seen so far, if that's the rate of loss of jurors, 2 or before we even start the trial, that could be a real problem, and that could lead to a mistrial, which in, I think, the defense's view is a win, even though it doesn't mean you start the trial again in a year or something like that. Mistrials, normally the court schedules the retrial as soon as they possibly can. But yeah, juror attrition is going to be a real issue in this case. And again, I couldn't agree more with Lisa. Opening statements are not going to be all day. Look for an hour from the prosecution and probably less from the defense, because all they're doing today is offering a preview. You're going to hear this probably many times. The evidence will show that ... The evidence will show that ... It's really just a promise to the jurors of what the facts will show. And if you're the defense, you do not want to be making a lot of promises. For example, you will not hear the words, you're going to hear from the defendant himself, because if you make that promise, nobody's going to forget it. So they will say, I expect the prosecution will try to focus on something they've already seated the jury on, which is you're going to hear from some people who are not that credible, but they're not credible because they're Donald Trump's friends. On the defense side, you'll probably hear some version of try to keep an open mind. The evidence is not all in. We don't have the burden, and just sort of the standard fare. But you're not going to see anything as flashy, anything as dramatic, as exciting as we're going to see during closing arguments. This is only going to be a preview, and it will not take the entire day at all.
You know, as Danny said, in mob cases, there are jurors that will tell the judge that they're afraid for their safety and they want to get off. He said this isn't exactly like that, but really it is in many cases, and that a lot of jurors are fearful of repercussions if they're in on a jury that's impaneled that rules against Donald Trump, because they want their names out. The judge trying to keep the names from getting out there, but this is, over time, this is proven to be very dangerous and tough.
In this trial, everybody's under duress. You know, Donald Trump's past statements before the gag, or even with the gag order, about the judge, about the judge's daughter, with the jury. Everybody is under a great deal of stress and concern about their safety. And I would add that it's Donald Trump, no matter which way this goes, that you got to keep your eye on, because Donald Trump right now is enduring something that he's never had to endure in his entire life, where he has to be somewhere every day and do what he's told. When he's told to sit down by the judge, he has to sit down. That happened on Friday at least once. When he tries to get on his phone, he's told to get off of his phone. He has to be there watching his former friends, David Pecker, Hope Hicks, and 2 alleged former lovers testifying for or against him. This is not what he's used to.
This is a guy, as we look at pictures of Donald Trump here, this is a guy, John Meacham, that has spent his entire life creating this warped reality that goes wherever his mind wants it to go, and keeping people around him that allows him to avoid reality, keeping people around him that does exactly what he wants to do. He was so proud of having a button on his White House desk. He goes, I press this button and somebody brings in Diet Coke. He loved the complete control and command, and he has his entire life. And now he's sitting down 6, 7, 8 hours a day, and
at 78 years old.
78 years old, judge telling him what to do, falling asleep, being mocked, getting angry about that. Yeah, it's this is quite a situation and new territory for Donald Trump.
And arguably, no American in history has so warped everyone else's reality as well, right? I mean, it's not simply his imaginative universe. He's imposed his imaginative universe, his grievances, his vision of enemies versus himself on everyone. And we're living in this warped reality. And so one thing about the last couple of weeks and about these images that I think, maybe this isn't a particularly popular thing to say, but this is actually a somewhat reassuring set of images, because it suggests that there is something more important than one single man and the will of one single man, and that is the rule of law. And he is submitting himself to the legal processes of the country. And it should remind people not of somehow or another his victimhood, but of that great Thomas Paine insight that we don't have a king. In America, the law is king. And what we're seeing in the New York courtroom, however tawdry the narrative around it is, the facts of the case, that doesn't matter. What matters is that the law itself is supreme. It's not just about the appetites and ambitions of one person.
And Lisa, there's more coming in other courtrooms pertaining to former President Trump this week. Also happening today, a hearing in former President Trump's civil fraud case. Remember that on Friday, New York Attorney General Letitia James asked a judge to void the bond Trump secured so he can appeal the decision. James is questioning whether the company that issued the $175 million bond actually has the funds to back it up. Lisa, so what's the math she's doing here? And is it possible the bond could be voided? And if it is voided, what happens?
Well, let's start with if it's voided, what happens? The current bond would stay in place until Donald Trump posts new security, either by posting $175 million and putting it in escrow with the court himself, or finding another bond company. One of the things that Tish James has said here is that Donald Trump's folks have hid the ball, that they did have an offer from Don Henke, who is the insurer here, to cover all of the bond had it remained at $454 million plus, but they never told the court that. Instead, what they told the court was, we had 30 different bond companies that we went out to, and none of them would cover the entirety of it. So let's start with today. What Judge Engoron has to decide is whether this existing $175 million bond is sufficient. And the AG's office is saying, no, it's not, for a few reasons. One, this isn't a company that's licensed to do business in the state of New York. Two, they've never issued a surety bond in New York, and they haven't even issued a surety bond anywhere for the last 2 years. And three, and perhaps most importantly, when you look at the financials of this company, the difference between their assets and their liabilities isn't enough to cover the bond. And that, coupled with the fact that they don't have control right now of the $175 million, but rather would have to let Charles Schwab, which holds the account that's collateral, know that they want to exert control, and then it would take at least 2+ days to do that. That has the Attorney General concerned that essentially Trump could run off and abscond with this money, and nobody who has enough to cover the bond would be left holding the bag. So, Mika, I'm very much interested in what happens at that hearing today, even as I'll be in the courthouse watching opening statements.
Wow. MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin will be following your coverage, and MSNBC legal analyst Danny Savalos, thank you both for coming in today. So stay with us. In just 1 minute, we're going to be joined by David Ignatius and to talk about the drama on Capitol Hill that culminated in a lifeline for Ukraine. We'll have all the details coming up next.
Well, President Zelensky, it is an historic morning. I want to get your reaction to this major news. The House approving $61 billion in aid to Ukraine. Will you get this aid in time to make a difference?
Це дуже важливе рішення. По-перше, я хочу подякувати.
Yeah, it's been so important. First of all, I'd like to say thanks to the Congress for the bipartisan support. And I'd like to say thanks to Speaker Johnson and President Biden.
Can Ukraine now win this war, or is the United States merely giving you enough aid to prolong this war?
Дякую. Я вважаю, що
Thank you. I think this support will really strengthen the armed forces of Ukraine. And we will have a chance for victory if Ukraine really gets the weapons system, which we need so much.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on Meet the Press yesterday reacting to the House overwhelmingly voting in favor of new funding for Ukraine as well as Israel and Taiwan. The Senate is expected to pass the legislation as early as tomorrow and send it to the president's desk to sign. Really incredible moment. And I have to say, wasn't sure Mike Johnson had it, but he does.
Certainly does. I mean, Mike Allen and Jim Vandehei wrote this morning in Politico. He defied the loudest, most threatening GOP personalities, dug deep into government intelligence, and shifted his position on the most vital foreign policy legislation in years. Why it matters? It's hard to overstate the importance of Johnson's road to Kyiv political conversion. He not only shifted his own position on funding and arming Ukraine, but defied a majority of his party to do it. Let's bring in columnist and associate editor for the Washington Post, David Ignatius, NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Ali Vitale. David, if you will, give us your thoughts on what we saw this weekend.
So, Joe, I thought it was a tremendously emotional affirmation of the ability of the United States, despite all of our political divisions and difficulties, to get to the right thing, to have a speaker, despite considerable personal danger to him and his speakership, decide that he was going to stand for what was best for the country, not for himself. I think back last month to when I was sitting with President Zelensky in Kyiv, talking about what he would do if USA didn't come soon, and he took out a piece of paper and kind of drew lines that symbolized the Ukrainian front. He said, without enough ammunition to match the Russians, we're going to have to retreat. We'll have to pull back. You could just see in his eyes what it meant, that this brave struggle was beginning to collapse at the front. So to get that aid finally, to have people stand up and be counted, starting with Mike Johnson, really meant something. I'll mention one other thing. I was at a social event yesterday with the Ukrainian ambassador, with a lot of the generals in the U.S. military who are most responsible for this war. At a certain point, a performer who was performing for the group sang Amazing Grace beautifully, stretching out every word. And I don't think there was a dry eye in that room listening to this amazing grace that the American political system had delivered, had discovered to pass this aid. So it's a big deal. The key question, obviously, is how soon can the aid get to the Ukrainian forces? They're getting pounded right now by the Russians. The Russians are on the advance. They need this aid as soon as they can get it.
Yeah, Ali, I don't know if they're singing Amazing Grace in the Republican cloakroom or not.
Hardly.
But Mike Johnson stepped out. He had a lot of powerful allies in the House GOP caucus that stood beside him. And it seems that Republicans really don't have the stomach for another challenge to the speakership. All that being said, as Republicans go back to work this Monday, what's the atmosphere there and what's the future of Speaker Johnson?
Well, look, I think they might not have the stomach for it, but they might get it nonetheless. We, thankfully, if you're Mike Johnson, have a week of a cooling off period right now, because although they were in on Saturday, they've now got a week of recess. And the fact that Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene did not privilege her motion and effectively make this a more urgent crisis upon their return in a week, that's probably good news for the Speaker's office. But there is a reality here where, in my conversations with Republican members, they are very frustrated at the fact that this is once again a looming threat to their majority. They don't know who could possibly take the position of this speaker. I candidly don't know why anyone would want the job, especially not at this point. But the reality for Mike Johnson, I think, is that even if he keeps the job, it's a question of the power of the position. And there are open questions about whether or not a sort of coalition governance can work in the House. It is a very majority-focused body, as you guys all know. But for Mike Johnson, there are the votes right now. 3 Republicans say that they want him to no longer be the Speaker of the House. There seems to be a difference of opinion on how they get him out of that job, whether it's a motion to vacate or just pressuring him to resign. There are also enough Democrats right now that would save his job. But that's where we come back to the idea of the power of his position. And I think that's the explanation for why I have heard from Republican members of Congress who support the Speaker, who also say he's basically done in his role. Now, whether or not they mean he's done tomorrow or whether or not they mean he's done in November when they start thinking about what the next Congress looks like, that's, I think, the question that we're waiting to see the answer to. But certainly this is a vote that they took over the weekend that you guys have been right to point out is a marked change in Johnson's personal opinion from when he was just a member to now being a speaker. But it's also a moment where we heard him time and again say that he was willing to put the selfish reasons and his job on the back burner to do the right thing, in his words.
Ed Elise here. If this $61 billion in funding for Ukraine had been held up even longer, would other European allies have stepped up, or would it have just been the beginning of the end there?
I think the briefing that Speaker Johnson got was that this would be the beginning of the end. If American aid hadn't come in 2024, then he couldn't guarantee that Ukraine would not have fallen by the end of 2024. But look, the Europeans have been putting a lot of money in and quite a lot of resources in. A lot of artillery, a lot of tanks, a lot of air defense systems. So it's not like the Europeans have been doing nothing. I think something like 60% so far of the funding for Ukraine has come from Europe. It should be more. But the Europeans lack specific systems only the Americans can provide. The ATACMS and systems like that, of course, the F-15s and 16s that US can provide, there is no European equivalent. So this is an enormous relief for Europe as well, which is, I think, doing its best to try and catch up. But there are a lot of countries in Europe, and they don't integrate their military. They don't integrate their defense production. They are going to take a while to do that. It's happening, but it's happening slowly.
David, can you talk through the next, say, 6 months in terms of the aid getting there, what this looks like on the ground as Putin himself confronts what Zelensky's able to throw against him?
So, John, Zelensky and the chief of Ukrainian military intelligence, General Budanov, both said to me that they expect significant Russian offensives this summer, starting maybe in June, perhaps even earlier, to try to consolidate their control in the areas in the east in particular, Donetsk and Luhansk, provinces that the Russians have claimed are part of Russia, but they don't fully control. The strategy being to try to have complete control by the time U.S. elections roll around, maybe Donald Trump is president, so that they can then bargain to take those permanently. That's the way the Ukrainians see it. Their strategy is to get powerful new U.S. weapons, including these ATACMS, long-range missiles, that can put Crimea, Russian-occupied Crimea, at risk, that can shoot from positions in Ukraine and take out Russian airfields, supply bases, key areas in Crimea, so that the Russians begin finally to have an incentive to negotiate. Crimea is probably what's most important for them. Sevastopol is their key naval base in the Black Sea. They don't want to lose it. If the Ukrainians, using these weapons through the remainder of this year, could really put Crimea at risk, you might have a situation where going into next year, the Russians say, it's time to negotiate some satisfactory end of this war to get what we want. I don't hear anybody saying that negotiation is likely this year, but the great thing about this aid package, the miraculous thing that Speaker Johnson and the Congress have done is to give Ukraine another year of life in this fight, maybe to get to the point where they can bargain from some strength next year.
David Ignatius and Ed Luce, thank you both very much for coming in this morning. And NBC's Ali Vitale, thank you as well. And coming up on Morning Joe, we're going to read from Liz Cheney's new op-ed in the New York Times calling on the Supreme Court to rule swiftly on Donald Trump's immunity claim. That's happening this week as well. Also ahead, new polling shows Robert F. Kennedy's third-party presidential bid cuts deeper into Trump's support than President Biden's. We'll dig into the new numbers.
Helps Biden lead by a couple
Morning
points.
Joe is on Donald Trump's hush money trial with expert legal analysis ahead of opening statements, which are set for later this morning, and who will reportedly be the first witness called by the prosecution.
Boy, a lot of talk about that trial this weekend.
Yeah, all weekend long. Twitter was going wild. Also ahead, it appears Ukraine will finally get the critical funding it needs after the House passed a package of foreign aid bills, which includes more military support for Israel as well. The bill now heads to the Senate despite efforts by Marjorie Taylor Greene, who got called out, yes, by the New York Post.
Yet.
Kind of sums it up, though.
Yeah.
Got to
well,
tell
it
you.
really
Good
does.
morning and welcome to Morning Joe. It's Monday, April 22nd. Good to have you all with us. Also with us, former aide to the George W. Bush White House and State Department's Elise Jordan, Rogers Chair in the American Presidency at Vanderbilt University, historian John Meacham, and U.S. National Editor at the Financial Times, Ed Luce is with us.
We're going to get to the lead story in one moment, which are the opening statements in Donald Trump's hush money trial. But first, John Meacham, you don't want to ever be melodramatic on things like this, but that Saturday vote was one that will be remembered for quite some time. It certainly will be remembered by our European allies who are beginning to question whether America was still in the fight for freedom.
Yeah.
I think it was remarkable, and I think that I know it may not be popular in a polarized time to say so, but I think the Speaker of the House did exactly the right thing. There was a very good New York Times piece about how he got there, and if you read that piece, you see it was a case where he educated himself. He listened to people who knew more than he did not prejudge it in the end, and it's a reminder that, you know, so much of the time, if you actually take the effort to understand the complexities of something that seems simple, you get to a different place. And that's what we want in leadership and citizenship.
Yeah, we will, Ed Luce, as we say here all the time, Meacham and I, of course, being from the South, Protestants from the South, we take conversions anytime, any place, anywhere. If you want to go down to the river and pray, you do it, sir. And it looks like Mike Johnson, at least on this one issue, stopped sounding like Donald Trump, started sounding like Ronald Reagan and Dr. Brzezinski and others who have understood the danger of an aggressive Russia.
Yeah, I think it was not so much a come to Jesus moment as a come to Bill Burns, the director of CIA, moment, because clearly the briefings Speaker Johnson got were strong and shocking enough for him to realize that he would be on the wrong side of history if he didn't do the right thing. And he did do as John said, he did do the right thing, and he really deserves applause for that, even though it was several months too late. But the price he's going to pay for this is yet to be seen. And, you know, I do expect there will be some kind of motion to vacate soon.
Well, the Democrats most likely will support him in that. We'll see what happens there. Elise, though, you know, it's so fascinating about these briefings that the speaker received. Made him understand that he really didn't have much of a choice if he wanted to do what was best for America, the best for Western Europe, the best for the West, the best for freedom. But we hear this from time to time from presidents, whether it was when Bill Clinton was going into office, he got the briefing when Barack Obama was going into office, he was saying a few things on the campaign trail that he stopped saying after he got, and forgive my language here, but in the intel community, they call it the oh shit briefing. And that's what he got, where you look at this material before you and you say those words and understand just how dangerous the world is out there and just what is required by American leaders to keep it safe.
No, Bill Burns is a legendary diplomat, and I would have loved to have been in that room for the meeting, as I'm sure we all would have, to learn and hear what really was his take on the stakes here. I do hope that the Biden administration is doing whatever they can to push the Ukrainians to not only to success, but to start seriously thinking about negotiations and what are going to have to be the concessions they want from Putin, what are going to be the concessions that they're willing to make. Because if at the end of the day we're just funneling billions and billions without any end state in mind or any strategy to lead to that end state, that does feed into what the other side's argument was, that there has to be some kind of strategy and some kind of end in sight instead of just spending money on endless war.
Well, I will say inside the White House, the belief has been we need this money so we can move both sides toward a settlement. Without this money, Putin goes wherever he wants to go. With this support, with the United States and Europe behind Zelensky's fight, behind Ukraine's fight, that's the best hope of ending this war. And I certainly agree with that assessment. It makes a lot of sense. I do want to say, yes, it was the CIA director's briefing and other briefings that Mike Johnson got. But as we learned during Donald Trump's administration, being told the right thing to do, the responsible thing to do, doesn't always lead leaders in this age of Trump to doing it. Again, very grateful that Mike Johnson listened and came out, did the right thing,
made his own decision,
put his job on the
what do
line,
they call that?
And that's courage.
Profile and courage.
In this case, that's courage. Applause going up along the Ukrainian line. The Russian invaders enraged that America was still there to fight. But you know, I will say the speaker also, I've got to say again, had Chairman McCall behind him, Chairman Turner, had other Republican chairmen who kept stressing the importance not just of pushing back on Russia, but pushing back on Xi and pushing back on Kim Jong-un and pushing back on the mullahs in Iran and showing them through supporting our allies who are under duress that America will be there.
Right.
Message sent across the world on Saturday. Can't overstate
We're
it.
going to have much more with David Ignatius on this in just a moment. But our other huge story this